Hello everyone, this is MMA Sherlock for the Bluff the Spot high stakes course. In this video I'm going to cover 3bet pots in position. 3bet pots obviously can get quite big and there's many different scenarios and 3bet pots come up extremely often. So it's very important that we come up with a good basic strategy as well as adjusting to our opponents whenever necessary. Obviously we start pre-flop. So let's look at some pointers. I recommend playing a 3bet or fold strategy. I do not advocate cold calling, especially when you play in a higher raked environment. Avoiding rake at lower stakes is extremely important. Flat calling may make some sense on the button versus early positions, but in any other spot I would not recommend it. Because our 3bet range is quite wide, because we choose not to flat call, we're 3betting a somewhat depolarized range. So we're going to include all of our really good hands, as well as stuff like suited connectors, some bluffs like suited aces, and some mergy hands that are barely good enough to 3bet. Hands like, for instance, pocket eights. Our 3bet sizing, therefore, will be a medium sizing. If we're looking to get thin value with lots of hands, we cannot go too big because otherwise villain will fold lots of worse hands. We want to build a pot and potentially win their entire stack, at the same time not 3bet only the nuts or nothing. It's very, very important to adjust to villain's range, because everybody opens different ranges, everybody calls different ranges to 3bets, everybody 4bets different ranges and plays differently post-flop. So since there's a lot of differences in strategies, we also have to adjust to villain. Deep stack play changes our approach a little bit. When you're deep, you should aim to play more hands that can make the nuts in big pots. Stuff like suited aces go way up in value, or medium pocket pairs, let's say. Hands like, for instance, ace-jack offsuit go way down in value because you cannot make a flush using both cards. You'll often end up with unplayable gut shots and weak draws. Short stack, the opposite happens, where now high cards are very important. So a hand like ace-jack offsuit goes way up in value when you're playing, let's say, 40 big blinds deep. And like 5-4 suited isn't quite so strong because usually you'll be all in on the turn. And 5-4 suited is the type of hand that wants to see all three streets and make the pot big by the river. Then on to the flop. The board texture and positions dictate your sizing. So if we 3bet button versus cutoff, our range is quite wide, let's say around 13%. And the cutoff's range for calling is still somewhat wide. So in a spot like that, both of us have somewhat wide ranges, so we can play a slightly wider c-bet range for a smaller sizing. Now, if both ranges are insanely strong, let's say cutoff versus under the gun, then you have to be a bit tighter and more polarized. So first off, let's look at some really good boards to c-bet on. So boards we can c-bet with a high frequency. So the first board I'm going to cover is A7-3 Rainbow. This board is really good for imposition because we're going to have aces, we're going to have sevens, we have all the good aces, and we don't really have too many hands that have no equity. So you'll see here that in positions EV is about 114 out of 165, which is huge. We have a ton of equity, 60%. That's a huge advantage. So we can see by a board like this very, very aggressively. You see right here, if I allow the solver to bet a quarter pot or nothing, it c-bets over 87% of the time. So this is a board on which you could c-bet your entire range. There's basically no EV difference and it makes your strategy a lot easier to play because you don't have to worry about what happens when you check back the flop. So I ran the board again and I forced imposition to bet full range. And what you see is that out of position should check raise very, very aggressively. You see it should check raise 26%. And most villains don't do that, let's be honest. Most villains check raise maybe 10% on a board like this. So you'll make even more money because you're exploiting out of position strategy. So even if Pi doesn't say you should see about 100% of the time, you're making extra money with his lack of check raises. So against a high frequency check raise, imposition has to defend quite a wide range. So you see against this check raise range, we raise. We're even re-raising sometimes for a small sizing, and we're not folding a whole lot. So obviously we're never folding with an ace. We're also not folding any pocket pairs other than 6s and 5s. And then we're floating some weaker hands like, let's say, Jack 10 suited. So basically the dynamic is high frequency c-bet, which means high frequency check raise by out of position. And then we also have to continue with a wide range. In spots where in position c-bet's more of a polarized range, out of position can check raise far less. So obviously in position can then fold a bit more and also 3-bet less. The second board we can c-bet at a high frequency is King Jack 4 flush draw. So this is again a really good board because we have kings and jacks every single time. Out of position never does. I did not include 4s for out of position. If we do, you'll see that the solver becomes slightly less aggressive in position, but not by that much. So you see that we're c-betting this flop 98% of the time. So it's a very small adjustment to be c-betting your range. So I ran the board again. And we're c-betting full range 1/3 pot. And you see now that since this board is not very good for out of position, and it's also quite wet, it's not a board on which we're going to check raise very thinly. So you see that we're only check raising around 11% of the time. Far less than on the a7-3, which is a far safer board if you do have a good hand. So since out of position is check raising a tight range, we can also check raise a bit bigger because we're not representing many thin value hands. Which means that we 3-bet the flop less in position and we can fold a little bit more. So you see right here, when you get check raised here, we're calling with our kings, we're calling with all of our jacks, we're calling with our premium draws, you know, our flush draws, our queen tens, our ace queens. And then we're folding some of the weaker stuff, like for instance, queen unsuited. We're only calling if we have a flush draw, and we're not even calling if we have a backdoor flush draw. And then hands like tens are close. So basically calling a jack, calling a king, calling the better draws, and folding the rest. So these boards are, I would say, are quite easy to play for in position because you can c-bet range. Now let's look at a board on which we cannot do that. So an example of a board we cannot c-bet much on is 7-6-5. Well, not much. We're c-betting 2.5% of the time, which is really crazy. This board is so bad for us that out of position could probably start leading. I'm not going to cover that because no villain leads really. So that would be unrealistic. So you see right here against a full range check, we're only c-betting 2.5% out of position. Out of position is going to have 8-9 suited, 7s, 6s, 5s, good hands like pocket 8s, flush draws, overcards. It's very difficult for out of position to have nothing. So you see that we barely have more than 50% of the EV at 71 out of 165. So it is a huge difference. And we don't even have an equity advantage. That is very rare in poker. When you 3-bet and people call, it's extremely rare to be behind an equity as the raiser. So we can simplify this board by just checking behind our full range. Now, if you're short, if you have 1.3x pot behind and you have kings on this board, you're just going to go with it. But at 100 big blinds, it sucks. If you're 300 big blinds deep, it's even worse because now aces or kings are really not looking good. So you have to be very careful on boards that are not necessarily bad for you, just very good for out of position because out of position has all of the strong hands. Whereas in the previous example, King Jack 4, out of position has none of the offsuit 2 pairs for King Jack, and it has no sets. Whereas here we have every single set and straight. In the first 3 examples, we saw 2 very good boards and 1 terrible board. Now let's look at a board which is not really good for us, but also not bad. Jack 8-6. This is a board that both players kind of hit. Out of position will have some sets, he will have straight draws, overcards, flush draws, good ace highs, etc. At the same time, he's not really crushing this board because no draws have gotten there yet. So we check full range out of position. And you see that in position mostly chooses the half pot sizing. It uses third pot as well as the big sizing sometimes, but the big sizing is clearly dominant. So if you want to stick with only 1 sizing on the flop, you can run the board again and pick a half pot bet, which is what I have done. So we checked, and in position is c-betting 70% of the time for half pot. So this board is a bit more tricky because we have 2 options. We can either simplify and bet our whole range for half pot, or we can have a mix of bets and checks. I would in general recommend c-betting half pot full range, and the reason is that out of position is likely going to make significant mistakes. Against a half pot bet, out of position has to check raise 16% of the time, which is a lot, far more than the average villain will check raise. Against 100% c-bet, you'll have to check raise over 20%, and nobody's really doing that. So you can exploit villain by being too tight out of position, and you'll realize too much equity. If we get to around 50% c-bet, then c-betting range will just give up too much EV, unless villain were to make huge mistakes. But there's not too many of those boards. Generally, we c-bet far less than 50% or far more than 50%. So that's good for us because we can keep our strategy somewhat simple. I would not say you absolutely have to c-bet range. In position, you can also play a mixed strategy. Just make sure that when you do that, you study the spot well first. So let's look at how we would play that. So you see, for instance, that high over pairs like aces and kings get checked back sometimes as traps. We check back some weaker jacks sometimes. That makes sense as well. We c-bet most of our draws, like 10-9, but not always. We check back, let's say, ace-king of hearts, a decent amount. You've seen that in a few previous videos, maybe. We're checking this hand back around 62% of the time. But if we look at a hand like ace-5 suited, it basically never checks back. I didn't even check that before the video because I already knew it was going to happen. It always happens. We can check back medium strength hands like 9-8 suited, for instance, or 8-7 suited sometimes. And of course, our showdown value hands, which without great backup. Stuff like ace queen of spades, for instance. You see, we're mostly betting it, but we're still checking back a decent amount. So it's really up to you whether or not you c-bet full range or not, but I would recommend that you do. Especially when you play against players who make significant mistakes. Unless you think they're so bad that you can induce really bad plays by taking a certain line. Of course, if you're playing against a recreational player and you see that, let's say, he goes absolutely crazy when you check behind, then sure, check behind the strong range and let him spaz off the money. Why not? But against good regulars, I wouldn't advise it. So just to recap, we can c-bet our range on the really good boards. We should c-bet at a very low frequency, if not check our range on bad boards. We can exploit out of position by over c-betting on some boards because they don't check raise enough and they don't put enough pressure on us. And when you check raise, you're mostly calling with your pairs and your better draws. And when the board is very wet, we tend to fast play a bit more than when the board is very dry. Now onto the turn. So on the flop, we've c-bet a very wide range, so we arrive to the turn with a wide range. So now it's time to start checking back often. You've c-bet a lot of second pairs and backdoors didn't improve, or hands like ace-king high, which you're mostly betting for protection more than anything. And those hands generally don't want to put any more money in the pot, so you want to check them back. Also means you have to check back some strong hands. So when you get to the river, you don't get crushed by villain's probing aggression. When we do bet, we bet a polarized second barrel. So we tend to size up in order to go all in on the river if the river is safe. As I said, we have to mix it up and be unpredictable and not just check back hands that cannot face any aggression. And when we do get check raised, we have to stab the turn at a somewhat high frequency. I'm going to go into Pio soon, and I'll show you different examples of stab sizes as well as ranges. So back to our first example, A7-3 rainbow. We've c-bet the flop with our full range. We got called. We pick, let's say, a 10 turn. 10 of diamonds. Check. And you'll see that Pio Solver bets large at a low-ish frequency. So I allowed it to bet third pot as well. But that sizing is not really being used. So now, you see, you want to check back with kings, you want to check back with queens and jacks, and some of your weaker aces, and even like a trap like aces or 10. You want to be betting with most of your strong draws, but not all of them. Let's say a hand like king jack of diamonds is being bet a decent amount. Stuff like, let's say, we're betting 8-9 sometimes with the flush draw. Actually, surprisingly little, given how strong our draw is. So we bet with a very strong range around ace queen suited plus, and then we check back most of our medium hands. Especially if out of position doesn't check raise enough flops, you have to be careful on the turn. So we check back around 75% of the time, and when we bet large. Now, if the turn is a little bit less safe, we could pick a smaller sizing. But to be fair, which card is really unsafe here? I can't really think of one. A 7 maybe? Let's look at a 7. Even on a 7, you see, out of position has a couple of 7s, 6-7 and 7-8, but so does in position. So this is not really a bad card for you. So since every card is safe, we would just only use a large bet strategy. In the second example, King Jack 4, this works a bit differently. So in King Jack 4, we also see bet our range. We got called. And the turn is, let's say, a 5. On the 5, you see, now we're betting more aggressively actually because the board is much more wet. And our king plus is still looking pretty good. So we're only using a large bet. And we're betting at a higher frequency. But this is on a 5. The 5 doesn't really change anything for out of position, right? Maybe 4-5 suited. If we go back and bet third pot, you'll see that pocket 5s are being folded, so we don't have to worry about that. So out of position, can bet very, very aggressively. Now, if the turn is more scary, we have to be more careful. Let's pick a very scary card. The 10 of hearts. Out of position does not lead once again. And you see now, not only are we checking behind much more often, when we bet, we're mostly betting small, only a third pot. Because out of position can easily have ace queen, it can easily have a flush, king jack, jack 10, good hands like, let's say, king queen. So you have to be much, much more careful. So on the clean cards, we just bet big, and on the bad cards, we have to size down and check behind quite often. The 5 of hearts is a different type of flush card. Sure, the flush got there, but ace queen didn't get there, jack 10 didn't get there, king jack didn't get there. So we're still pretty passive. We check behind most of the time. But now when we bet, we are mostly using the larger bet. So you see that if the card is really bad, we become very passive. And then when the card is not great, but not awful, we become a little bit more aggressive again. That makes a lot of sense intuitively. So what about getting check raised? We get check raised, we call, and the turn is a 5, let's say. So out of position should be betting large with a polarized range. I think that makes a lot of sense. But we check. And you see that we're betting pretty small. The reason is that out of position can definitely check raise you again. So if you don't have a great hand. You obviously want to control the size of the pot, and you want to just get thin protection. So once we call a check raise and we get checked to, you can bet a third pot at a somewhat high frequency, as you can see right here. Now on the 10 of hearts, again, we check. And you see now we're checking back extremely often. And when we bet small. That all makes tons of sense. So out of position can have a somewhat strong range. And therefore, when it does check, we are still careful in position. So again, you see, the safer the card, the more aggressive in position becomes when facing a check. Let's look at how to play the 5-6-7 board. So on 5-6-7, we don't have to worry about the check raise because we never bet in the first place. So it goes check, check. And I think that lots of villains have different strategies. So against different strategies, you obviously have to use different counter strategies. So you can see that on, let's say, a5, which is kind of a blank, we can lead out at a pretty high frequency. Often for a small sizing, but also for a large sizing. On a bad card, let's say an ace, obviously we lead out very polarized because in position is going to check back hands like ace king, ace queen, ace 5, etc. So if you're leading, you're kind of saying I got better than an ace already. And if you have better than an ace already, why not bet huge? On a king, I expect the same thing to happen. So you see, once again, we're saying we got better than just your king, queen, ace, king already, so we bet huge. The more villain probes and the smaller the sizing, the more we have to call and the more we have to raise. Against a very polarizing strategy, like 182 into 165, we can stick to just only calling. You see, we would have to go all in next, and Pile Solver is doing that only 1% of the time. So you could just ignore that and say we're only going to call or fold. I mean, what would you want to fast play here, really? You can have 9-8 suited, sure, and you get the money in, great, always, but you have to think about the rest of your range, because you see right here, we have so many hands that we're worried about protecting. All of our kings, our queens, our draws, etc. So villain is saying I got basically the nuts or nothing, so we probably just want to only call. Whereas if he were to lead really small, then you have to start raising more, because then he might start including lots of thin hands for value. But on a king, he can't really do that. So what about Jack 8-6? Let's have a look at that board. So on Jack 8-6, we c-bet and got called. And you'll see the same tendencies. On the 4, we keep betting at a high frequency because the 4 doesn't really change anything. 7-5 suited should not be in out of positions range. And he doesn't really hit any other equity on the 4. So we're comfortable betting. So we bet pretty large at a pretty high frequency. If we make the card even better, you see, we bet slightly more. But if we pick something scary like a 10 of hearts, out of position even starts developing some leads, although I would not recommend using any. And now you see, all of a sudden we're checking back very often, and when we bet, we're only betting small. So you see that on safe cards, we're betting at a somewhat high frequency, and we bet kind of big. Whereas when the card is very scary, all of a sudden we bet much smaller and much less often. Let's pick a really interesting card, an ace of hearts. Now again, you see, we're betting small. If we want to value bet ace king, we can't just bomb the turn, because then villain can just fold worse hands. So if we want to get value, we have to bet small. On a king, that's not the king of hearts, we can just keep on betting big again, because the king is a fantastic card. We're going to bet lots of hands like ace king and king queen on the turn. The king is also not very good for out of position, so you can see we're betting almost full range actually. That's very, very aggressive. On something like a queen, it starts getting a little bit more scary. 10-9 did get there. Queen jack is in out of positions range. At the same time, it's not the scariest card. So you see right now, we're already checking back a bit more. And we start leaning a bit more towards a smaller bet, even though the larger bet is still preferred. So once we bet kind of large, on, let's say, the 4. Out of position will not have too many check raises because we're repping such a strong range, and out of position will not have many good hands, so we should not be fast playing too often. Some villains may never even check raise. On more dry boards like a7-3, it will likely check raise even less. Let's have a look. There's some new draws on the board now, but the board is still not that wet. So we bet pretty large. That's what PioSolver suggests. And you see right here, we're not really fast playing that much. There's just not many hands that out of position has that it would want to fast play. And if out of position has an ace, we're also not that worried about giving away free equity, because in position will not have much more than 20-25% equity anyway. So just to recap, on the flop we see about a very wide range, so on the turn we have to tighten up. We check back lots of hands, good hands as well as bad hands, and medium hands of course, and when we bet large. So as I said, you have to mix up your strategy and be unpredictable. And when we call a check raise on the flop and villain checks the turn, we tend to bet small, especially in the 3-bet pot, because the pot is already so big and you don't want to put in too much money and bloat the pot and get check raised. So be very careful there, guys. Most villains, to be honest, don't check raise, so you can stab a little bit more often than PioSolver suggests. Last but not least, the river. So on the river, we kind of continue our turn strategy with polarizing bets. So if the river doesn't change anything, on let's say ace-7-3, turn 8, river deuce, we just keep on betting big with a polarized range. And the pot is already so big that we can just go all in. If the card is very bad, we could potentially introduce a smaller sizing, especially when we're playing deep stacked. I'm going to switch to Pio soon and cover calling river all-ins as well. When you get check raised and face a bet and a shove, obviously your opponent is repping a very, very strong range, and we have to be careful to not call off too light and lose all of our money. We're also going to face river probes. Since we checked back a lot on the turn, villain gets to the river quite often, and he will very often lead out, often over 40% of the time. So we have to look at how we're going to combat that, because we cannot just allow villain to keep on betting and we have to fold all of our bad hands, or he'll bet small and we don't do anything about it. And we're going to exercise thinking about our range. When our range is very tight, it's much easier to keep your frequencies in check. So back to a7-3, turn 8, we bet large and get called. And the river is really safe, a deuce. No leads. And you see that out of position shoves very, very often. If you have a hand like ace-king, what are you afraid of? Out of position can basically not have you beat unless it has specifically a hand like pocket eights. So on the blank, you can keep on shoving very aggressively. The same way you can bet very aggressively on the turn blank. Now, if the river is a bit more scary, we have to slow down. So on the 10 of diamonds, we have to be much more careful. We're still shoving a decent amount, but far less frequently than before. Because ace-10 suited is in out of positions range, as well as all the ace-6 of diamonds hands, and maybe even a few unpaired diamond hands. So the card is less safe again, and you see that we slow down. On the king of diamonds, you'll see roughly the same thing. Ace-king is even stronger now, and villain cannot have king-x of diamonds. But at the same time, he can still have a couple other flushes, and it's not less likely that he's going to be calling down light with a hand like ace-5, let's say. On king jack 4, we bet range, got called, turns a 5, not a bad card, we keep on betting large. And on a blank, like let's say a 4, you'll see the same story. you'll see that we're shoving all in very, very aggressively. Because on the turn, if we're repping something like king, queen plus, how are you now possibly beat? So why would you not keep on shoving here? Even king 10 is being shoved. Even king 9 is being shoved. Although, to be fair, we don't have those hands very often because we'll often check them back on the turn. So on the blank, we shove very aggressively. We're shoving all in as a bluff, mostly with the low flush draws. Stuff like, let's say, 6-7 suited, because we're unblocking all of the big stuff that's going to check call, check fold. And we're mostly giving up with the big flush draws ourselves. So you see, for instance, a hand like ace queen of hearts, we always give up. Because if villain has ace 10 or ace queen of hearts himself, he will often check call twice. So we're now blocking some hands that he'll be folding. So we can also bluff some of the lower stuff like 10-9 suited, let's say. But the big stuff is rarely being bluffed. So what about bluff catching? Let's look at what we would do if villain check raises us. So we call the check raise. The turn is the 8 of diamonds. And villain keeps on betting. At a high frequency, that makes sense. Because the 8 is not really a card that makes you slow down. It actually bets small quite often. Just because the board is quite dry and the board is already pretty big. So we get called. And then on the king. On the king, you see we're mostly betting large. Whereas on something like a 4, we'll be betting all in a little bit more often. So in a spot like this, you've called the flop, you've called the turn. You want to think about your entire range. When you call an all in here, you want to call, first off, you have pocket aces to call with, you have 7s to call with. You have some combinations of 7s as well as 7-8 to call with. You have all the hands like ace king, ace queen to call with. So be careful that you don't just start calling down with every ace. Because you already folded hands like kings and jacks on the turn. So if you're calling with a hand like an ace, so if you're calling with any ace, you'll be calling almost your entire range, which would be a mistake. You see that out of position is mostly bluffing with stuff like 5-4 suited, or occasionally a queen jack of diamonds with a missed backdoor flush draw. So you want to unblock flush draws in your opponent's range and generally look to block the really strong stuff. A hand like 5-4 suited is nice to bluff because he realizes a hand like 5-4 suited is nice to bluff in villain's shoes because villain realizes he has no showdown value, but now he blocks revert 2 pairs. And even an occasional revert 5-6 of diamonds. So against a shove here, in general we should be calling with our strongest aces, but we should be folding the weaker ones. So we're folding around 57% of the time. Now if villain bets smaller on this card, obviously we're going to be folding far less frequently. So then we'd be calling our weaker aces sometimes, and we'd even turn some hands into a bluff. So just be careful, guys, that you think about your entire range. So which hands do you get here with on the river? You're going to get here with any ace, basically. You're going to get here with some draws that we can obviously fold against aggression. And we'll get here with some hands like 7-8, some blocker hands. So make sure to pick the best hands in your range first to call with, obviously. And then second off, you pick the best hands with blockers to villain's value range. And then the hands that block villain's bluffing range are the hands we call last. So what about a river probe? Against a c-bet and a call on an 8, it goes check, check. And we see the 4 river. You see that out of position is leading out sometimes. So we're block betting a decent amount. That makes sense. Because out of position has hands like ace 10, which prefer not to check, but at the same time don't want to bet huge. So it introduces the block bet sizing. But there's also really good hands, like let's say 8-7 suited, you prefer to bet larger. So the smaller out of position bets, the more you have to raise and the more you have to call. So you see against this small bet, in position is shoving all in very, very often. With some blocker hands, like let's say 6-7, which blocks the straight as well as 2-pair and a set. And we're shoving our value hands. And then we're mostly calling with our weaker hands. Against a larger bet size, we're folding more often, but we're still shoving it all in as a bluff with roughly the same types of hands. Bluffs like 6-7, let's say. Hands like pocket tens don't really work out very well because we're blocking some of our opponent's bluffs and we unblock all of his value hands. So generally when you want to turn your hand to a bluff in a big pot, you want to block your opponent's nutted hands. And his nutted hands are mostly pocket 8s and pocket 7s. And 6-5 of diamonds. The bigger your opponent bets, the more important blockers are. So if villain is only representing the nuts or nothing, then blocking the nuts is very important. But if villain block bets, he's representing nowhere near the nuts, so then those blockers are far less important. So just to summarize, on the blank river, we tend to shove at a high frequency with a very polarized range. You can just bet big if you're playing extremely deep. When calling a river all in, you have to call pretty tight because villain has a weaker range out of position. So when villain check raises and then bets twice, his range is very strong. So be careful not to keep calling your stack off with just one pair. When facing a river probe, we have to be aggressive with both calls and raises, and we mix it up well on the turn so that on the river we have strong hands to fight back with. The smaller out of position bets, the more often we call as well as raise. And then when villain bets really big, blockers to his value range are extremely important. And when thinking about calling all in, you have to think about your range. Your range is pretty tight, generally under 40 combos, which means you can count which combos you're going to call and fold and see whether or not you're overcalling and overfolding. And since villain has a very tight range, blocking the right value combos means he could be significantly overbluffing. Now, some tips. If, in case you're unsure, think about imposition play in a single raise spot, because in that spot you play almost exactly the same. If the board's very good for you, you bet a lot. If the board is very bad for you, check back a lot. You mix it up on the turn and bet a polarized range. On the river, you generally have a fairly tight range, so blockers become more important, and you can think about how high up in your range you are and which hands you want to be calling with. As I stated before, you have to be unpredictable. If you always show up with the hands you're supposed to show up with, then you're very easy to play against. You want to put your opponent in difficult spots. So make sure to use some unorthodox lines sometimes to throw your opponent off, so that next time he's going to think twice about attacking you. And perhaps most importantly, you have to adjust to your opponents. People play out of position 3-bet pots extremely differently. So playing the same pile solver strategy gets everybody can be a mistake. So you'll be playing well, but you can potentially play a lot better. So look at his statistics, look at his timings, look at his sizings and overall tendencies, and then make adjustments. Because poker at the end of the day is a game of adjustments, because we don't play perfectly. Our opponents certainly do not, so we have to respond with adjustments sometimes. That was the end of the video, guys. I hope you all learned something, and I wish you all good luck at the tables. This was MMA Sherlock for the Bluff the Spot High Stakes course. Good luck.